Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're going to get started. I think I see one person just joined, so we'll wait just a second. Got a couple more popping in. Let them get settled. Thanks for joining us today to talk about building spaces for humanity, the role of reflection and ungrading practices in an online course. My name is Karen Bunch Franklin. I work at Georgia, the Institute of Techno. Oh my gosh, I work at Georgia Tech. I just completely drew a blank on how to say the long name of my university. That's okay. And I'm a faculty teaching and learning specialist, and I also teach education courses here at Tech in our Tech to Teaching program. And then I previously taught at University of West Georgia and Clemson University and adjunct. My main role is in faculty development, and I love to focus on alternative assessments and grading practices. So Tyler, I'll let you introduce yourself real quickly.
Sure. Great to see everybody. My name is Tyler Watts. Karen and I previously worked together at Clemson. That's how we met, and we started talking about ungrading practices and alternative assessment, and that's just carried forward into as we've gone into separate roles. So I'm a faculty member at Mercer University, also in Georgia, and we just started a program for instructional design and technology at the graduate level. So excited to share with you today.
So let's get started. We're going to spend our time together just kind of doing a quick review of the literature around reflection and ungrading. We'll also be looking at some initial findings that we're finding in our interviews that we're conducting. And then we'll have some areas for guided discussion and reflective practice. So if you don't already have a piece of paper, pencil, or have your favorite electronic note-taking app up and open, we encourage you to do that now. So just to kind of frame where we're coming from and the principles that we're using as we are thinking about the role of reflection and learning, it's kind of thinking about how we can humanize online learning, bringing in that social presence that's in the community of inquiry framework. By looking at ways that we're building empathy, awareness, and presence, and more importantly, trust within our online spaces. And we do have some disclaimers to get started. First of all, Tyler and I both teach in educational technology and foundation courses. So that's our context. Our classes are typically smaller, less than 25. Sometimes we might have multiple sections that can go up to 60 total, but we generally have smaller class sizes. And most of our students are in the K through 12 arena or would like to be in that arena, or they're working in student affairs or some area along those lines. And so our classes and our contexts and our students might look a little bit differently than yours do. So we always want to acknowledge that. And then also just think about the way that we approach pedagogy, our teaching philosophy, what values we bring into our teaching. Those are all things that could be slightly different than you as well. And so as we talk about this role of reflection, we really want to encourage you to think about what changes really fit you and your style and represent the values that you want to bring in within the context that you're teaching as well. So we're going to pause for just a second and give you a chance to have a little bit of reflection, thinking about your day so far, one thing that you've experienced in the conference that really stands out to you, why that stood out to you, and what actions you might take as a result of that experience. So we'll give you a minute or two to think on that and write down your responses. Hey, I'm kind of coming back together now. Hopefully, you had time to think about that. Is there anyone that would like to share maybe something they experienced and why it stood out to them and what action they might take, maybe in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute as well. Okay, no worries. No one is required. Hold on to that though. We will come back to it later on. Totally fine. Some of us have had really busy days, and this might be your first session. So I hope that you will love it. Okay, Jennifer enjoyed Amy's presentation earlier. Thanks so much for sharing that as well. So kind of just thinking a little bit about our framework and how we came to think about reflective practice. We're thinking about it from the angle of what, so what, and now what. So by Rolf, and he used this in relation to nursing education, but it has a lot of practice among other fields. And so when we think about what, we're thinking about the fact and the details of what may have happened, or what we were exposed to, what we read, what content we engage with, what classroom discussions we may have had. When we think about so what, we're thinking about why that experience matters. We're exploring our different feelings that we might have around it, different experiences we might have connected to it, and any lessons we learned along the way. And then when we get to now what, we're thinking about what actions we might take going forward and how we might apply those insights or anything we've learned through this reflective process, how we could take those insights and really think about them in a very practical way. So I think that that's the framework that we've been using as we think about reflection and practice. And so then we want to kind of just frame a little bit about what ungrading means to us as a human-centered practice. And so the definition of ungrading that we have chosen to use for our research is the practice of minimizing or eliminating grades in order to really focus on meaningful feedback and student learning. As we know, grades can often be inequitable, they can be inconsistent, they can definitely increase stress for students and faculty, and they can decrease intrinsic motivation for learning. When we think about ungrading, it gives us a chance to kind of refocus, reshift, and recenter back to learning and really helping students build critical thinking skills and thinking about that metacognition. How are they able to think about what they're thinking about, what they're learning, and how that can help them become better learners? We also feel like ungrading helps to create a more inclusive and collaborative space, building a stronger community as well, and really giving us a chance to build off of that to have this space of trust and intentional presence with our students. And so this is kind of our approach to ungrading as we think about it within the context of our courses. Now we use ungrading in the sense, like I said, to mean like minimizing or eliminating grades, but there are other ways of ungrading or having alternative grading, such as collaborative grading and standards-based or specifications grading. These are all fall under that big umbrella of alternative grading. And so in our particular research, we are true ungraders in the sense that we don't give any grades throughout the semester, but there are other forms that could be considered as well if you don't want to fully go that route. So as I said, in our own practice, we have eliminated grades altogether, except of course for the very end of the semester where we are required to give a final grade. And so we use complete or incomplete. In some cases, I have used revisions needed as a third option as well. We also use reflection journals weekly for our students, so they have the opportunity to really think about those questions: what, so what, and now what. thinking about what they've learned that week, what they took away from it, how they could apply it going forward, maybe some experiences or prior knowledge that they brought back into thinking about that content. And then collaborative grading as well, where the final grade is really a discussion amongst us and the students to think about how they progressed and what they've earned throughout the semester.
So I'm going to give you a chance. We've talked a little bit about our practices, but wanted you to kind of think about your own grading practices, or even maybe thinking about your experience as a student and the experience of grading and what that meant for you. And again, go back to your notes, whether that's electronically or on a piece of paper, and think about what does that relationship with grades look like? So this is our what. How does that relationship impact your view towards ungrading? That's our so what. And then what might rethinking your grading look like? Then the now what. So we'll give you a couple minutes to kind of think through that. And then again, if you'd like to share out, or if you'd like to put something in the chat as a reflection on this, that's perfectly fine. We'll give you a prompt for that. Or if you just want to keep that to kind of just personal reflection, that's perfectly fine as well. So a couple of minutes just to think through those questions. So I'm going to pause us there. We certainly will have some time to come back to these questions at the end as you think about with our Q&A. But I saw Jennifer put a comment in the chat about our relationship with grading. Even if we approach it with alternative assessment, we still have that final letter grade at the end that we've got to report. So appreciate that. Anthony mentions mastery of learning outcomes rather than the grades we give. So I use grades because I'm required to, but not because it's the best way to assess. So assessing for mastery, it's great. Also, by the desire to have machine-based assessment. So our methods may be more about efficiency, I guess, than about what's best for learning. Excellent. Well, I hope as you reflect on this, we'll come back to some of the things that may have come up in your reflective practice as we get to that Q&A. We just wanted to share kind of briefly about some of the findings that we had from our research and see maybe this resonates with you and some of the practices you've put in place, or maybe it inspires you to think about some of these alternative assessment practices. So just very briefly, for this particular, the findings we're sharing out today, we took a look at the reflection journals. Karen mentioned that that was a key component of our courses. And so we looked at that from a textual analysis perspective from our two courses, and also notes and memos from ourselves kind of as the teachers, researchers in this study. So we had online graduate students. There was a total of 32 between the two classes. And really, we sought to understand what's the role of reflection, both for ourselves and for our students, and that intersection of ungrading and reflective practices. Really, our courses kind of modeled were very similar in terms of some of the scope. Karen talked about some of the design elements. So just kind of getting into that in a little more detail, we both use collaborative grading where the grade was determined at the end through dialogue. We had reflection journal check-ins along the way, and that varied a little bit. And then our reflection journals were completed as discussion boards in both classes. And the way we did that was making that a discussion that was private. So if you're in Canvas, for example, it was making an individual discussion for each student. It really was a group discussion, but with groups of one. And so students could be open and frank about their own experiences without having to worry about what other students were seeing. And just some of our preliminary findings, some of the things, and we'll break down each of these. But generally, there were positive impressions around ungrading, and it led to a shift in perspectives about learning as students encountered ungrading in the courses that we taught. Students have strong relationships with grades, and so their relationship to grades and learning is a significant bond. And so there was some uncertainty when that is not there about what a grade communicates or what not having a grade, how feedback communicates some of those same things and what that looks like in same and different ways. And then the feedback and reflection are really essential to learning, which I think we can see that from the research. This just kind of affirmed that, and especially in alternative assessment, how important that feedback was really affirmed. So generally positive impressions around ungrading. This practice was new for all of our learners going in. Um, and uncertainty was a very common emotion, especially at the beginning. The experience, though, was much more valued over the course. And generally speaking, out of those 32 students, there were still some mixed feelings at the end about ungrading as a practice. Those students who said, hey, I want to know how I'm doing, and that A motivates me. It helps me to be clear about how I'm doing in the course. And I wasn't sure about this process going forward. But generally speaking, all positive results from the other students. Just a quote here from one of the students in their reflections. I have not encountered any issues with the ungrading process. I was apprehensive at first. I was sure that I couldn't work in the system, but I gave it my all. And now as we come to the end of the course, I can see how this process could be beneficial on a more mainstream level. Thinking about grades and their relationship to learning, students are of course very accustomed to grades and what they communicate. And motivation around grades continued to dominate some students' thoughts. Not having those indicators for grades was challenging for some. And so that's one thing to think about for alternative assessment practices. Is it something you want to employ? Is how do you help students navigate that? How do you do it in a way that doesn't create more uncertainty, and providing those guide rails for students that need that structure and that communication? And a lot of distress and worry about being surprised at the end. And so it was really important, Karen and I found, for making sure that we develop trust and establish trust with our students. And a lot of that came through the feedback that we were offering. A quote here, I like the concept, but as someone who's always been evaluated on a grading system, it makes me nervous to only know how I'm doing at the end of the course. And I think that was a misconception about the ungrading process. This was an early journal reflection. And so it was important for us to say, actually, you should know throughout the course how you're doing, but it's going to look a little different than what you're used to. And it's going to come in more qualitative feedback than a grade. A lot of students talked about their perspectives about learning and how this has shifted their thinking about learning. So focus more on the content or on the skills in the course, and what they were learning personally as opposed to a grade. They felt less stress and pressure. One of the things that I think really stands out to me is they felt safe to take risks or be more creative. And especially for our students who are education majors, they felt that they could apply it more practically towards their own classrooms as opposed to what they thought we were expecting as the teachers within the course. They also enjoyed the course and felt more motivated. Just a couple quotes that kind of stand out to us as we were evaluating this was, I do feel like I have more freedom to be creative, to enjoy the learning process, and to appreciate the written feedback I receive. And it almost feels like a relief being lifted off my shoulders. And then the last one, I think, really that drove a lot of what we're thinking about when we think about reflective practice and the importance of feedback was that these were really essential to learning, especially in an alternative grading approach. So timely and focused feedback were critical for students. If they weren't getting that and they weren't getting a grade, then they could feel kind of unmoored from the class and knowing what to do next. Students did appreciate the space to allow for candid reflection, and that dialogue and engagement felt really meaningful to them. A lot of students expressed just how appreciative they were to have that space, and even that they don't take that time for reflection normally, and they thought it was a really valuable practice that they wanted to apply going forward. And then they really appreciated that there was a space for feedback on the process and the approach. One of the things that excuse me, Karen and I really emphasized was how's ungrading going and what are you taking away from that and what could be improved. So we use that reflective space also as kind of a space for getting feedback about the design of the course itself. And just a couple of quotes to go with this. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you. And I hope that the students in the future semesters will appreciate this learning experience as much as I do. This reflection journal feels like a very safe space. So just some key takeaways from some of those findings that we've been thinking about as we employ this process going forward is that ungrading needs careful scaffolding. We saw that students really struggled at the beginning, and so making sure to provide for that scaffolding that students still find the support that they need, even though they may not have necessarily the familiar communication around grades that they would have in a traditional base grading approach. Alternative assessment does have potential for developing a more human-centered learning environment, just from what we were hearing from students and some of the shifts around their own learning and approaches. And that the reflective practices that we used are as a form of feedback are really valuable. A little bit beyond the themes of what the students shared and from reflecting on our own practices, especially I had a program where I moved from alternative assessment back to traditional based grading, and I felt like I was just missing out on getting to know the students. And it was, I think, largely not because of the alternative assessment, but because I didn't have that reflective journal piece in place. And so even if I do traditional based assessment, I brought that um, reflective journal back into the process because I felt like it was a really powerful way for me to get to know my students in an online environment and to speak to them directly, and also to help them practice that reflective process in their own learning. And then managing the reflections, both in frequency and scope, is really essential. Karen mentioned at the beginning that we do have smaller class sizes, and she mentioned, having a couple sections with like 60 students. That was my experience this last fall, and my approach has always been, if you post something in the reflection journal, even if it's in one of our optional weeks, I'll respond to it. And what I found with 60 students across two sections is they were highly reflective, which was great. But it also meant that my workload looked significantly different than it did when I had a single section of 20 students. And so being mindful of my own workload and my own care towards myself and thinking about my practices and what that might look like, that's both meaningful for the students, but also manageable for me and for other instructors. So I'm going to offer just three ways for getting started, and then we're going to do kind of a final reflection, and then open it up for questions and conversation amongst all of us. I've been seeing the chat and seeing some of the great insights shared there already. Consider how to add reflective practice into your own courses or your daily life. So I don't reflect as nearly as much as I should on my own learning and my own process of development and growth. But so how might that look like in your course? We gave you kind of a model of one way you might consider framing questions. But so what are the ways that that might look applied in your own context? Go gradeless. And Karen and I were talking about this concept just yesterday of gradeless. I like this phrasing because it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to do what we've done and take on an ungrading approach and not have grades completely, but maybe you start applying assessment more selectively of when grades are going to be given or when it's more about that qualitative feedback about developing drafts or giving students feedback that isn't focused solely on the grade. And so in terms of grade less, you could think of it as going gradeless or just going for less grading. And then providing a space for dialogue in your course, even if it's optional. We found that really resonated with the students. It's certainly benefited us, especially in an online environment, thinking about the ways that we can engage in more kind of just informal conversations and dialogue with our students. That's really enriched the experience for us, and I think from our findings for the students as well. So our last little pause today, and then we would welcome you to share out your ideas here, but also any other questions or insights you might want to share about reflection, about ungrading, is what is an area you want to explore more? Are there elements you might adopt for your own practice? And then what questions or insights do you have? So I'm going to pause again for about a minute or two just to kind of have you think about these questions, think about the questions previously, and then feel free to start sharing in the chat when I give you a prompt. And you're welcome also to ask any questions about our process or thinking once we have that moment of kind of mindful reflection. So we'll give you a couple minutes here. Okay, it's been a couple minutes. So any thoughts from these questions that you'd want to share from our previous reflection questions? Feel free to put something in the chat, or you're very welcome to open up your mic and share as well.
That's a great question about STEM disciplines. I will say that I have seen a number of STEM professors use reflective practice. And I will say that my work here at Georgia Tech, which is predominantly a STEM university, we do have a lot of faculty that come through our workshops and start adopting a reflective practice. So I wouldn't say it's probably the norm in STEM disciplines, but I also would say that I'm starting to see a very small shift in that. And I can only speak from this experience here. I do think there might be a few STEM faculty at Clemson that did it as well. But I do think people are starting to see the value of reflection. And so hopefully that shift will start to move a little bit.
Anthony talked about how do you motivate those students who have been conditioned for so many years to be motivated by grades? And I think that's something we found in our findings in our course was that it was still a significant factor even for graduate students, where I think when we think about undergraduate students, that expectation around grades is even higher. Whereas, for many of our students, they're adult learners, they're motivated by factors outside of it or for the attainment of the graduate degree and not so much the grades, but that's still very present. I guess one thing I would share that I'm kind of experimenting with now as I have a program, and this was why I went back to traditional based grading for um, after doing alternative assessment, was I was very worried about my students coming into a new online experience for the first time and having to also learn a new approach to assessment at the same time. And so I had first year students and I did a traditional based program or traditional based grading, and then slowly introduce them to some concepts around alternative assessment. And so I think when in the shape of a or the scope of a program, I'm able to kind of scaffold that not only in a single course, but across multiple courses, where now I'm being strategic about I'm going to do traditional based grades and then introduce them to specifications based grading. That was one of our options there, where they can kind of choose based on what criteria. It's a lot of more focus on kind of mastery, like you mentioned. Um, and then moving towards an ungrading. So I think that's how I've kind of approached it in terms of, I don't know if that will work on motivations, but at least giving them a lot more scaffolding and having the freedom to do that in the context of a program. When your course is in a sequence, whether that's general education or in a major, I think it's a little bit more difficult because the factors outside of your course certainly impact that. So I don't know, Karen, any thoughts about motivation?
Yeah, I would say that there are two things that I try to do to help with motivating students to, you know, try to like relax a little because they do get extremely anxious at the beginning when you're like, there's no grades. So there's two things I do. One is I try to be very transparent about why I chose to do ungrading as a pedagogy in my courses. I talk a lot about what led me to that and the steps I did before I went truly gradeless. So, initially I would try to do minimal scales, or I might would delay the grade. So I might would give feedback and then I would give a grade. And then I share like kind of that whole process with my students and so that they know I didn't just randomly pull this out of a hat and I'm just trying to stress them out by doing ungrading. So I'm really clear about my purpose and my why. I'm very transparent about that. And I do think that helps. I do think that helps students see that this is a well thought out decision. And then the other thing I do is consistently remind them throughout the semester that at any single point, they can reach out to me and I will be glad to talk to them about their growth in the course and where I see them at, or where I see them as far as like the level of the course that they're at. So, are you an A level, B level? If I have to put it in those terms, I always let them know that. I used to do required conferences twice throughout the semester, but I found that for the most part, my students became really comfortable with the feedback I was giving them, and they didn't necessarily feel like the conferences had a lot of value. I then made them optional, and I would have a handful show up. Now I don't require or set aside time for that, but I always remind them that I'm available to have those conversations if they need to. And then there was one other thing that I thought about that just completely left me. It will come back to me. It will come back to me before the session ends, I hope. But I definitely try to be really clear about why I'm doing this and letting them know I'm available. Oh, it's the other thing I was going to say is the other thing I consistently tell them is that if I feel like you're not on a level to be successful in my course, I'm going to reach out to you and have a conversation with you. I'm never ever going to surprise you at the end of the semester. I make that promise on the very first day, and I reiterate that promise throughout the semester as well. And I do think that helps reduce some anxiety for my students around the fact that there are no grades. And once they start seeing the level of feedback that I give them, I think that also helps with that as well.
Casey in the chat mentioned a focus on experiential learning and developing a campus definition where reflection is required, but can look very different. So looking to provide support to faculty teaching these courses.
I would suggest looking at James Lang. I can't remember what chapter it is off of the top of my head, but in his small teaching book, he talks a lot about he calls them connection journals, I believe, and he gives a number of examples there that could be really helpful, as well as some case studies that could be helpful. I also will say that and I know this is probably not what you mean by can look very different, but I also allow my students full open choice of how they decide to turn in their reflection. It can be written down on paper, it can be handwritten, it can be a concept map, it can be an audio recording, a video recording. They can even doodle if they want to, as long as they add in enough context that I understand what they're thinking. And you should see some of the amazing ways that I get that. I've had several students that did use art to kind of help draw out their reflection, and it is incredible what they can do. But so I don't know if I'm pretty sure that's not what you meant by that, Cassie, but if but I just wanted to share that because it made me think of that. But I definitely think that the reflection journals can there are a lot of opportunities. I have some that would create websites to put their journal reflections. I mean, it's really just quite incredible. Um, yes, it does follow UDL, Anthony, which is something else I try to do in my courses as well. So it's a good way to create those UDL principles into your course.
Great
Any other
thoughts
thoughts
and
or questions?
questions. Yeah.
We have approximately 10 minutes left, so we'd love to keep chatting.
I guess one question I have for the group, if you feel comfortable sharing, is are there others doing kind of alternative assessment practices, and what does that look like in your course?
I'll just say while we're waiting for somebody to maybe write in the chat or chime in, one of the things that Tyler and I have both seen is confidence that our students gain throughout the semester in the ungraded environment. And some early, very preliminary research that we've seen going into our next project, looking at the transition from ungrading back to a traditional graded course, is that students are taking that confidence with them into the course. So, and that confidence is around so many things, around them as a learner, around them as someone that, has the confidence to speak up more in class or explore a little bit more, or even taking the risk in that traditional graded class because they feel more confident in who they are as a learner, based on the experiences they had in the ungraded classroom. So I think that's a really positive way that reflection played a key role in that as well.
Yeah, I think this is kind of how I got started with alternative assessment. Was I had, similar to you, Anthony, like an iterative project. So they receive feedback on all the elements of the project, and then I just felt like it felt very natural to kind of extend that to a broader level in the course, of focus more on feedback and how are you improving upon what you did in the previous elements of this project that I was working on. So that's great.
Yeah, same for me. My students build each time, and it's quite awesome to see the growth in that as well.
Well, we don't want to take um, any more of your time than need be to answer questions or anything. So we would love to continue to have conversations about alternative assessment practices. So our contact information is up there, as well as I think we'll be able to make the slides available as well. Um, and so would just encourage continued conversations. Karen mentioned we're doing a project about after ungrading. So if that's something you have an interest in, feel free to get in contact with us. And thank you so much for attending our session today. We really enjoyed the conversations.
And we're happy to stick around till the session ends, in case someone did have a question they wanted to ask us. Otherwise, have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.